stop performing for the crowd. Reclaim your mind. A heavy, suffocating wave of physical self-consciousness is anchoring your awareness right now, making you feel entirely awkward, unpolished, and hidden beneath a painful layer of somatic shame. You are lying in the darkness, yet your eyes are tightly shielded and your chest feels constricted as your mind relentlessly replays every minor angle of how you appeared to others during the day, comparing your external presentation to the effortless, sculpted grace of those who always seem to be noticed. There is a deep, aching vulnerability in your throat that views your natural, unrefined shape as an absolute defect that must be aggressively corrected, camouflaged, or hidden from the sight of the world. This relentless hypervigilance keeps your entire physical frame held in a state of rigid alignment, forcing your spirit to carry the exhausting weight of an invisible audience that never truly sleeps. Let the specific, mineral atmosphere of this room begin to settle the frantic momentum of your self-reproach. The air around your bed carries the dry, grounding scent of stone dust, crushed flint, and the faint, clean aroma of weathered limestone, a cool, ancient fragrance from a masonry yard where raw materials are allowed to rest in their native weight without any demand to be chiseled or rearranged. Beneath you, the mattress acts as a dense, unbending foundation, offering a heavy quarry floor that completely releases you from the burden of sculpting your appearance or decorating your form for the approval of a spectator. The tight, defensive boundaries across your collarbones and down through your limbs can finally dissolve into the shadow. Right now, dear friend, you are safe enough to soften. You are not broken because your body feels clumsy or unpolished tonight. And the heavy inadequacy you are carrying is not a personal failure. It is simply the natural ache of trying to force a wild, sovereign piece of the earth into an artificial standard. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and you do not have to solve your whole life tonight. Consider a surprising paradox that sits at the very root of this physical shame. The parts of your appearance that you find most awkward, raw, and unrefined are precisely the places where your true spiritual sovereignty remains entirely untouched. We are conditioned to believe that to be valuable and safe in the eyes of others, we must continuously sand down our rough edges, presenting a polished, flawless statue that conforms perfectly to the passing trends of the courtyard. But deep Buddhist insight reveals that the moment a material is completely sculpted and smoothed to please a spectator, it enters a state of endless, fragile dependence, vulnerable to every change in the weather and every critical gaze. The rough, unchipped flake that falls away from the chisel into the tall grass is the only part of the stone that escapes the violence of the hammer, remaining permanently whole, heavy, and sovereign within its own ancient architecture. Maybe you have felt this too, the agonizing loop of wanting to accept your natural form, while simultaneously feeling that if you stop monitoring your posture or hiding your perceived flaws, you will be left entirely invisible and unwanted by the world. We treat our unpolished corners as a structural deficit, spending our quiet nighttime hours replaying social interactions and readjusting our bodies in the dark, believing that if we just analyze our presentation layout long enough, we can build a version of ourselves that no longer triggers the sting of exclusion. This reaction only adds a secondary wound of deep, cellular exhaustion to the initial vulnerability of being seen. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the cool, dry air sink deep into your lower ribs, moving far beneath the self-conscious heat of your face, entering the immovable bedrock of your pure physical existence. Nothing is required of you now, and there is absolutely nothing you need to force to be held by the ground. Imagine leaving behind the bright, critical galleries of the village markets and stepping into the tall, dry grass that grows behind an ancient limestone retaining wall. In this dark, unvisited sanctuary, the earth is littered with raw, fractured fragments of unworked stone, resting undisturbed in the shadows, completely unbothered by the aesthetic standards of the temple carvers. There are no mirrors here, no scales to balance, and no decorative lines for you to maintain through the midnight hours. There is only the cool, mineral weight of the masonry floor, and the immense reassurance of a foundation that knows how to support an unchipped existence without demanding that it change its dimensions. You have arrived at a place where you can finally stop sculpting your story stepping into a sensory world that allows you to trade the frantic friction of comparison for the heavy, silent safety of an unpolished night. Deep within the high limestone terraces of the western ridge, where the wind always tasted of dry chalk and the thin, pale dust of chipped flint, lived a young apprentice named Kazuki. He was a youth tasked with carrying heavy pine logs to line the storage trenches, yet his spirit was constantly crushed by a silent, burning humiliation that made his limbs feel thick and clumsy whenever he walked past the grand courtyard of the temple. Kazuki's older peers were master carvers, who could draw fluid lines across white marble with a single stroke of a chisel, their intricate scroll work praised by the traveling monks and local magistrates who visited the main shrine. Kazuki spent his long hours submerged in the shadow of the back terrace, sweeping up the irregular fragments that fell away from the monuments, utterly convinced that his own broad shoulders and rough, asymmetrical features were a tragic indicator of structural failure. Every night, as he lay on his thin, woven mat, his mind would ruthlessly retrace the smooth curves of the statues in the front courtyard, transforming his lack of physical elegance into an absolute sentence of isolation. He felt like an accidental lump of rough river mud left on a shelf of fine porcelain, completely certain that to be loved or even noticed, his external shape had to be manually resculpted. Driven by a desperate urge to find some secret method of transformation that would refine his presence, Kazuki walked out to the dry, dusty yard hidden behind the ancient limestone retaining wall. This was the dwelling place of Master Noboru, an elderly stonemason who had spent his youth carving delicate icons for the capital, but had long since retired to shape simple, heavy foundation footings for the monastery grain stores. When Kazuki entered the silent, shadow-filled workspace, the hectic noise of the lower village faded into the steady, slow scrape of a coarse sandstone block moving against raw granite. The air inside smelled faintly of dry lichen, parched earth, and the clean, mineral residue of ancient flint dust that drifted through the shafts of late afternoon light. The master was not working on a brilliant, delicate figure. He was sitting quietly on a low pile of unworked flags, examining the fractured edges of a rough, three-cornered fragment of unworked black basalt that had been cast out during the roughing of a main pillar. Kazuki stepped forward and bowed, his breathing ragged and shallow as he laid bare his internal wound. He spoke of his profound shame, the constant weight of feeling physically awkward under the gaze of the carvers, and the agonizing midnight habit of replaying his movements to correct his posture. He asked Noboru to teach him how to hold his body so that he might look like the finished marble icon, smooth, symmetrical, and worthy of public admiration. Master Noboru listened to the entire torrent of words without changing his posture, his worn fingers remaining resting lightly against the dark, jagged side of the basalt piece. When the young apprentice finally fell silent, his chest heaving with the heat of his confession, the elder did not offer a single word of philosophy. Instead, he picked up the raw, three-cornered fragment of black basalt and placed its full, unpolished weight directly into Kazuki's open hands. The stone was remarkably heavy, its surface rough and uneven, with sharp, unchiseled fractures that had never been smoothed down or forced into a decorative pattern. Noboru did not tell him to look at the sky. Instead, he led Kazuki over to the edge of the limestone terrace, where a famous marble statue of a celestial guardian stood overlooking the main valley. The statue was beautifully carved, its lines so delicate they seemed like silk caught in stone. Yet the seasonal frost had driven a fine network of cracks across its polished shoulder, and the relentless mountain rain had begun to blur the intricate details of its face. The master pointed to the base of the monument, where the marble was pulled tight against iron pins to prevent the entire structure from tipping into the ravine. Noboru reached out and tapped the guardian's marble forearm. It gave off a high, brittle ring, strained under the immense mechanical pressure of its own ornate balance. Then, the master pointed down into the deep, unmanaged grass behind the retaining wall, where hundreds of rejected spalls, the raw, unchiseled flakes that had broken away during the initial squaring of the blocks, lay half buried in the soil, completely untouched by the carver's hammer. Noboru looked into Kazuki's self-conscious eyes, took a heavy wooden mallet, and struck a light blow against a small projecting scroll on the grand statue. causing a fine decorative flake to snap off and drop into the dry weeds below. "Look closely at the basalt fragment you are carrying," Noboru murmured, his voice as dry and steady as the limestone dust in the rafters. The old stonecutter asked a simple question that cut straight through Kazuki's defensive calculations. Which piece of stone in this valley is currently free from the terror of being broken by the changing style of the town? Kazuki looked down at the dark, uneven basalt fragment resting in his palms, comparing its raw density to the cracking marble of the Guardian. The stone that had been carved into a beautiful, delicate shape was brittle, split by the winter frost, and continuously wearing away under the critical gaze of every visitor who walked through the courtyard. But this three-cornered basalt spall, along with the unpolished fragments in the tall grass, was completely solid, unyielding, and whole. It carried no decorative pattern. It performed no aesthetic service for the monks, and it held no static posture to please a magistrate. Yet, because it possessed no artificial symmetry, it was the only piece of stone in the entire yard that was completely free from structural strain. It did not need to be altered by a chisel to hold its place on the mountain. Its integrity was already absolute within its uncarved, natural mass. A profound wave of emotional recognition washed through Kazuki's chest, loosening the rigid, protective knot that had held his neck stiff for months. He looked at the vast, unpolished fragments half buried in the dry grass, and realized that his entire internal struggle had been a frantic, exhausting attempt to force his physical existence into a delicate, decorative pattern. Believing that to be valuable, he had to match the fragile symmetry of the marble icons. He had viewed his unrefined, heavy frame as an indicator of failure, completely blind to the reality that his very separation from the carver's standard was what granted him the freedom to breathe without snapping under public scrutiny. He saw that his natural body did not need to be sculpted by the opinions of others to possess its native wholeness. Its presence was already absolute within its own unpolished nature. The twilight was deepening across the high limestone terraces now, the white dust in the masonry yard fading into a calm, uniform charcoal gray. The dry, clean aroma of the parched earth and the cold flint hung suspended in the cool evening air, grounding Kazuki's physical awareness in the immense, uncelebrated quiet of the back clearing. Take a slow, unhurried breath, letting your own shoulders sink flat into this heavy surface, allowing your mind to rest upon the solid, uncarved weight of the basalt as it settles into the dark of the night. This old story from the high limestone terrace is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, unyielding stone, or entirely numb to the very real ache of feeling physically awkward or invisible to the world. It is not an instruction to lock your heart away in a dark quarry, pretending that the sting of a critical glance or the heavy weight of social exclusion does not leave a genuine, throbbing bruise across your self-image. It is showing us something much quieter, a profound shift in our internal posture that allows us to inhabit our natural form without letting it become an object of constant, painful modification. When we sit in the dark and look at our Latinite physical shame, we begin to see that the deep, suffocating exhaustion we carry does not actually stem from the shape of our features or the design of our limbs. The true suffering, the knot that contracts your chest and turns your sleep into a trial, resides not only in what happened when you were seen, but in the specific way the mind continues to hold what happened long after the spectators have turned away. In our modern inner lives, what we call attachment is that frantic, hypervigilant urge to force our natural presence into an artificial symmetry that will guarantee a stranger's validation. It is the desperate craving to look exactly like the polished statues in the main gallery. A silent belief that if we can just sculpt our presentation layout to match a popular trend, we will finally be safe from the threat of rejection. This craving operates exactly like a heavy chisel, striking a raw block, continually chipping away at our quiet energy through endless loops of self-analysis, believing that if we remain hyper-conscious of our appearance, we are protecting ourselves from future hurt. We become like an apprentice who spends his vital nighttime hours frantically polishing a brittle monument, completely blind to the reality that trying to match an unnatural standard is what truly breaks our structural capacity to rest. The ancient insights of Buddhist wisdom help us stop adding a second wound to the first. The first wound is the baseline vulnerability that life brings to our physical form, the bad camera angle, the casual comment about our features, the heavy sense of being invisible at a gathering, or the simple truth that human biology produces an infinite variety of unpolished, irregular shapes. These moments are painful, and they leave a real stinging heat across our awareness. The second wound, however, is the massive edifice of physical shame, body comparison, and latte-night architectural reviews that we build around that initial sting. It is the secondary spiral, where the mind convinces us that if we stop monitoring our posture or hiding our unrefined corners for even a single hour, we are accepting defeat and admitting to a lifelong failure. This continuous carving of our own self-worth is what truly depletes our body, trapping our nervous system in a permanent alarm that refuses to let the muscles soften. When we practice true mindfulness within our somatic self, we are simply learning how to view our natural form through a cool, non-judgmental awareness. This awareness is the quiet, grounding quality of the mind that can notice the burning heat of an insecurity without choosing to step directly into the habit of self-loathing. It is the capacity to feel the heavy self-consciousness in your jaw or stomach and say, "There is a dense point of vulnerability here in my frame," rather than, "I must aggressively change my appearance before I am worthy of being loved." By shifting our relationship with this physical presentation, letting go ceases to mean passive neglect or giving up on our health. Instead, letting go becomes an act of immense quiet sovereignty, the willingness to step back from the stonecutter's gallery, allowing your unrefined corners to rest undisturbed in the dark until the frantic urge to perform stops vibrating through your limbs. Impermanence, when felt deeply within the mineral reality of the body, becomes a source of profound relief rather than a cause for dread. Every curated trend, every conventional standard of grace, and every high-profile metric of beauty that we see in the village markets eventually loses its momentum, cracks under the winter frost, and wears away under the rain. The physical configurations that seem so permanent and all-important during a social gathering are subject to the same erosion as a white marble statue standing in a mountain gale. An accidental lack of symmetry or a perceived physical awkwardness cannot permanently destroy your internal integrity unless you continuously pick up the hammer to chisel your own spirit. Wisdom reminds us that the most heavily sculpted and polished surfaces quickly reveal their brittle nature when the ground shakes, while the heart that knows how to rest in its unchipped mass remains entirely secure. Compassion, in this dry, limestone light, is the spacious grass that meets your physical shame without turning your awkwardness into a source of personal failure. It is the willingness to look at the self-conscious, defensive part of your mind and recognize that this heavy loop of comparison is not a defect in your spiritual character. It is simply a tired, primitive part of your survival biology that has been staying awake to protect your borders, believing that if it stops criticizing your form, you will be left entirely exposed to the judgment of the crowd. By meeting this internal critic with a slow, heavy, and completely unbothered physical presence, you allow the frantic necessity to look different to dissolve, transforming the brittle desire for beauty into a dense, grounding mineral weight. In a moment, this horizontal clarity will move from an idea you listen to into a concrete, physical practice you can truly drop your entire weight into. The dry, clean air within our quiet backyard remains perfectly still, totally unconcerned with the grand aesthetic displays of the front temple. The unpolished basalt fragments hold their immense mass in absolute, dignified silence, allowing the gray lichen to grow over their unchiseled slopes without any need to justify their dimensions to a passerby. Take another slow, intentional breath, letting the hot static in your temples sink flat into the mattress as we prepare to guide the mind into a much deeper state of physical relaxation. If it feels right, allow the physical boundaries of your body to spread outward, surrendering your complete weight into the solid, unmoving foundation that supports you tonight. There is no need to engineer an artificial stillness within your mind, nor is there any requirement to alter the simple, automatic rhythm of your breathing as it passes quietly across your lips. Perhaps you can simply observe the cool, dry air entering your nostrils, unhurried and soft, leaving a light trace of chalky dust as it exits your frame. With each slow exhalation, you might allow the sharp edges of your shoulders, your chest, and the small, hypervigilant muscles around your eyes to lose their tight configurations. Imagine your physical self sinking down into the dense, dark baseline of the mattress, dropping the defensive posture of the day completely, like an unmanaged piece of granite that has finally fallen into the tall grass behind the masonry wall. As you lie here in the deep shadow of your room, you might shift your internal focus away from the vertical, straining territory of the temples and the throat, allowing your center of gravity to settle deep into the base of your spine. For many hours, your vital energy has been pulled upward into a hot, vibrating knot of self-consciousness, tensing like stone under a heavy hammer, as you tried to manually adjust your presence and hide your perceived flaws. Right now, there is no need to force that momentum to vanish instantly. Even noticing the faint, rhythmic movement of your lower abdomen as it rises and falls is entirely enough. You do not have to perform this meditation perfectly to prove your spiritual integrity to an invisible judge. There is no score being kept in this room, no penalty for carrying an unpolished body, and absolutely nothing you are required to fix before you are permitted to drop your effort into the dark. In this open, non-judgmental space of your own awareness, you might allow one specific, recurring thought or memory from your day to appear without trying to fight its presence. Perhaps it is a critical glance that left you feeling completely clumsy, an awkward interaction where your form felt visible and exposed, or a persistent urge to stay awake to mentally correct your physical presentation for a future audience. Do not try to aggressively push this memory out of your head, and do not dive into its details to argue with the spectators in your imagination tonight. Instead, if it feels right, you can name the emotional pattern softly to yourself, perhaps using the silent words sculpting, masking, or measuring against marble. Recognizing the habit in this gentle way is enough to create a small, cool distance between your core self and the heat of the shame. Once you have named the pattern, you might imagine taking that entire, burning narrative and placing it gently into the center of the rough, three-cornered fragment of unworked black basalt that sits behind the ancient limestone wall. Let the raw, unpolished stone hold the entire weight of that physical inadequacy for you. In your imagination, you can reach down and touch that heavy mineral mass freezing cold, encrusted with dry gray lichen, and completely detached from the aesthetic demands of the front courtyard. Gently, without any sense of anger or violence, you might allow your awareness to merge with that uncarved spall, letting your self-image rest directly upon its unyielding, sovereign surface. There is no need to force a sudden catharsis, or to demand that your mind instantly love its natural shape. You are simply allowing the frantic necessity to look different to drop flat against the bedrock. Watch what happens to that image when you stop feeding the memory with the fresh oxygen of your comparison habits. You might notice that as you leave the worry resting within the heavy, unchipped mass of the basalt, the erratic, cracking tension of your overthinking naturally begins to lose its velocity. The dry, solid stone does not fight the judgment, it outlasts it, holding your presence perfectly still within a dark, self-contained realm of earth until the volatile anxiety naturally runs out of momentum. The urgent necessity to ornament yourself to the village begins to dissolve, replaced by the deep, mineral density of a frame that is far too grounded to be broken by another person's gaze. The mind stops carving into the skin and begins the quiet, slow process of settling into an unshakable baseline of inner peace. If your mind occasionally drifts back into its old habit of adjusting your posture, or if a sudden wave of physical shame surfaces around your collarbones, remember that you can return to the cool, grounding texture of your breath whenever you are ready. There is no timeline you must follow tonight, and no one is asking you to promise your nervous system a state of permanent, immediate healing. True transformation does not happen by violently erasing your natural vulnerability, but by realizing that your awareness is like the vast, dry masonry yard itself, capacious enough to let the raw fragments rest safely in the grass without needing to shape them into icons. Let each slow, unhurried breath feel like the natural grounding of a weight, allowing your limbs to become heavy, porous, and completely unresponsive to the urgent static of the daytime world. In a moment, our journey will return to the limestone terraces, following Kazuki as the seasons shift and bring an unexpected event that will test the true stability of his unpolished heart. The deep, dark textures of the old mason's yard will continue to open a path toward an absolute, indestructible form of inner sovereignty. For now, simply allow yourself to remain right here, unmoving and encased in this protective shadow, letting each breath sink you an inch deeper into the vast, silent safety of the night. 2 complete seasonal turnings marched across the high ridges, coating the chalk terraces in heavy layers of frozen pine needles before the early autumn thaw arrived in the valley. Kazuki continued his silent labor behind the limestone wall, his days marked by the steady carrying of foundation blocks, his inner world slowly acquiring the quiet rhythm of the unvisited yard. One clear evening, while clearing rubble from the main path leading to the front shrine, a sudden, violent shudder rippled through the bedrock of the mountain. It was an earthquake, a deep tectonic shift that lasted only the space of a dozen breaths, yet its raw power sent a massive shockwave vibrating through the foundations of the entire temple complex. When the dust finally settled over the central courtyard, a scene of absolute devastation met the eye. The intricate, highly polished marble guardian statue, which had stood for generations as the crowning glory of the terrace, had snapped cleanly at its strained, brittle forearm and toppled face down onto the flagstones, shattered into hundreds of jagged, unrecognizable shards of polished stone. As Kazuki hurried into the ruined courtyard to assist with the clearing, he found his old peers standing in a silent circle, their faces pale with a profound, helpless disorientation. Among them stood the senior carver who had once loudly mocked Kazuki's broad features and thick, unrefined limbs in front of the local magistrates. This master craftsman was kneeling in the white stone dust, his hands trembling as he tried to piece together a delicate, shattered scroll from the statue's fractured mantle, his entire identity completely unraveled by the destruction of the monument he had spent his life maintaining. Looking at the senior carver's tear-stained face, a sudden, powerful surge of the old reactive heat flared up in Kazuki's chest. The familiar internal critic roared to life, tempting him to gloat in the destruction, to view the broken marble as a vindication of his own struggle, and to use the craftsman's vulnerability to soothe the deep scars of his own historical exclusion. But as Kazuki stepped forward, his hand brushed against the heavy, broad-faced iron pitching tool with a mushroomed head that hung from the leather loop at his thigh. The tool was blunt, heavily nicked from years of splitting raw granite, its surface covered in a dense layer of cold slatagrease and ancient dust, an unadorned industrial object that carried the precise marks of honest, unpolished labor. Touching that scarred iron head brought an immediate, sensory memory of Master Noboru's quiet workspace behind the limestone wall. He recalled the raw, three-cornered fragment of black basalt resting undisturbed in the deep weeds, entirely untouched by the seismic shock, because it held no artificial pattern that could be split by the shifting of the earth. Kazuki stopped completely in the middle of the ruined courtyard, his feet planted wide upon the flags. Instead of speaking a biting word or allowing his old resentment to dictate his movements, Kazuki chose one small, quiet act of discipline. He paused and took a single, slow breath, letting the dry, chalky air fill his lower lungs, anchoring his somatic awareness deep within his own unpolished mass before he could react to the scene. In that deliberate interval of stillness, a profound realization opened up within his frame, changing his relationship to his own history of shame. He looked at the shattered guardian statue and realized that he no longer needed to treat his own awkward features as a tragic failure or an emergency that required fixing. He saw that the beautiful, delicate marble had been trapped in a state of fragile perfection, destined to snap under the relentless pressures of a shifting world, while his own unrefined nature had been an absolute protection all along, keeping him whole, heavy, and unbroken, precisely because he had never been forced into a decorative mold. A wave of unvarnished compassion moved through Kazuki's heart, not because he was pretending the old insults had never happened, but because he saw that his senior peer was currently crushed by the very same standard of fragile beauty that had once caused him so much night agony. Kazuki did not say a word about the past, nor did he look for a dramatic apology from the weeping carver. He simply knelt in the dust, gripped a massive, jagged chunk of the broken pedestal with his broad shoulders, and effortlessly lifted the heavy burden away from the path so the old carver could move safely. He did not wait for a word of gratitude, and he did not look around to see if the other monks were watching his strength. He simply turned back toward his quiet back terrace, experiencing for the first time the deep, sovereign density of a heart that no longer required an external mirror to know its own completeness. The mountain shadows were stretching long across the masonry yard now, the pale flint dust on the stones fading into a calm, uniform charcoal gray. The dry, clean aroma of the parched earth and the cold granite hung suspended in the heavy atmosphere, grounding Kazuki's somatic awareness in the immense, uncelebrated safety of the present moment. He had not become a magically perfect saint, and the memory of the exclusion still carried a blunt, distant weight, but he had discovered how to let his uncarved form rest securely upon the mountain without needing to sculpt his presence for the village below. Take a slow, horizontal breath, letting your own shoulders sink flat into this level dark, allowing your mind to rest upon the rough, heavy face of the iron pitching tool as it settles into the quiet depth of the night. When we track the heavy, subterranean architecture of our night suffering, we invariably discover a frantic, protective mechanism that mistakes internal rigidity for psychological defense. We lie awake in the dense shadows of our rooms, our bodies held completely unyielding, while our minds run an unceasing, secondary processing loop that is utterly convinced it can fix a perceived physical inadequacy through the sheer velocity of overthinking. This habit of turning a critical comment, a moment of social awkwardness, or an unpolished feature over and over in our memory is an instinctual attempt to regain control over an environment that has proven itself to be unpredictably judgmental. We believe, deep down, that if we keep the burning friction of our physical shame alive, we are erecting a defensive perimeter that will prevent us from ever being caught off guard or left exposed to exclusion again. The true devastation of this process, however, does not lie in the external standard itself, but in the silent, agonizing way we turn our perceived flaws into a fixed personal identity. When someone treats us like we are invisible or casts a dismissive glance at our form, the mind doesn't just experience the localized sting of that single event, it begins to weave the vulnerability into a grand, defining monument of who we are. We become the clumsy one, the person who was deceptively pushed to the side, the constant outsider to the world's beauty. To maintain this heavy identity, we are forced to continuously feed the internal conflict, throwing our vital nighttime rest, our breathing, and our cellular energy into the furnace of self-judgment to keep the story from cooling down. We use shame as a crude administrative tool, believing that if we can just review our presentation layout harshly enough, we can somehow force our natural presence into a shape that satisfies our craving for absolute validation. This is the precise juncture where the unhurried clarity of Buddhist insight offers a profound, grounding sanctuary for your tired spirit, translating the ancient mechanics of suffering into simple, emotional terms. True wisdom reveals that every difficult experience is composed of two entirely distinct elements. The first pain, which is what life brings to your door, and the second pain, which is what the mind adds through its desperate resistance to reality. The first pain is the raw, unvarnished impact of an unpolished truth, the accidental camera angle, the cutting remark from a peer, the heavy sense of being uncelebrated at a gathering, or the simple reality that human biology produces an infinite variety of irregular, asymmetrical shapes. This initial sting is a localized occurrence that moves through your timeline, like a seasonal frost through a mountain quarry. It leaves a real, throbbing ache, but it does not possess the capacity to permanently warp your fundamental value unless you choose to hoard the debris. The second pain, which is the true source of your midnight exhaustion, is the elaborate, suffocating maze of body comparison, historical regret, and invisible trial scenes that the mind builds around that initial vulnerability. The second pain is the voice that takes an unrefined contour or an accidental awkwardness and transforms it into an absolute guarantee that you are fundamentally flawed, deficient, or destined to be permanently left out of happiness. We do not possess the power to stop the changing winds of an erratic world from occasionally dropping a critical judgment into our clearing. But we have the absolute capacity to stop opening the drafts of our intellect to fan the flames. Every time you notice your mind drafting a brilliant self-correction or a biting counter-argument at 3 in the morning, and you choose instead to drop your awareness back into the dense, dark baseline of your mattress, you are choking out the oxygen that keeps the second pain alive. Peace, when understood through this earthy lens, is never defined as the complete absence of difficulty, vulnerability, or emotional heat. True peace is simply a fundamentally different relationship with that difficulty when it arrives. It is the capacity to feel the heavy self-consciousness in your jaw and the tight contraction in your stomach, and realize that you can contain that raw survival energy beneath the unpolished sod of your immediate physical presence, without needing to turn it into an open forest fire. You begin to discover that an unresolved social interaction or an unwritten future is not an emergency that must be instantly solved before your body is permitted to soften. It is merely a raw block of stone resting in the dark, completely incapable of consuming your inner sovereignty unless you choose to give it your active obedience. By recognizing this internal mechanism, your relationship with your own overthinking shifts from a state of violent frustration to a quiet, spacious observation. You no longer need to exhaust your resources trying to force your mind into an artificial silence, nor do you need to condemn yourself for carrying a heavy heart after being judged. You can simply allow the vulnerability to exist as a localized, passing sensation, trusting that the natural, horizontal mass of your body is wide enough to hold the raw energy until it stops vibrating through your limbs. You are no longer an overstrained sculpture ready to snap under the pressure of an old comparison. You are the vast, silent quarry floor itself, dense, unyielding, and completely unbothered by the shifting trends of the lower valleys. In a moment, this grounding perspective will move directly into the concrete settings of your modern daily existence, exploring how to maintain this soft, contained posture amidst the specific triggers that usually disrupt your nightly rest. The dry, clean atmosphere within your room remains perfectly balanced, completely unconcerned with the frantic aesthetic displays that occupied your afternoon. Let your physical frame continue to surrender its remaining structure into this supportive darkness, allowing each slow, rhythmic breath to remind you that your safety is already solid, spacious, and entirely complete right now. This unchipped, grounded sovereignty is not a remote philosophy meant to be left behind an ancient limestone wall, or reserved exclusively for a retired stonecutter handling raw basalt in the high mountains. True inner peace is practiced in the very small, unpolished friction points that make up the raw, daily texture of your modern existence. It is found in that precise micro-moment when you are lying awake at night, checking your phone for reassurance, watching the cold glass screen glow against the midnight darkness of your bedroom as you wait for a text or a notification that will validate your presence. In that moment, the old habit of your nervous system is to treat the digital silence as an absolute emergency, a sign that your external presentation has failed and that you are being quietly excluded from the courtyard. True wisdom begins when you notice that frantic impulse. Pause before reanalyzing your message layout, and realize that a lack of an immediate response cannot diminish your native mineral density by a single grain. We live in a hypervisible culture that constantly demands we act like polished marble guardian statues, forcing ourselves to maintain a flawless, symmetrical presentation, even when our interior landscape feels heavy, unraveled, and fragmented by self-reproach. You might find yourself walking through a crowded social gathering, smiling and pretending to be okay while feeling an immense weight inside your chest, terrified that your natural, unrefined posture is being silently judged by those around you. We look at a digital gallery. We compare our private, uncarved struggles to the bright, edited milestones of our peers, and we immediately decide that we are falling hopelessly behind the conventional layout of a successful life cycle. The mind creates a false sense of absolute urgency, telling you that if you do not instantly correct your appearance, change your personality, or force an unpredictable relationship into absolute certainty, you will be left invisible and unwanted forever. But a profound transformation occurs when you discover that not every self-conscious thought deserves your active obedience, and not every heavy feeling is a mandatory command that requires a reaction. When you feel a sudden surge of physical shame prompting you to camouflage your form, or mentally rehearse an old mistake to fix what went wrong, you can choose to simply sit with the raw uncertainty rather than running to sculpt yourself for a spectator. Taking a slow, deep breath before answering a critical question or reacting to an uncomfortable comment is a form of immense internal discipline. It is a way of demonstrating to your own body that you are no longer a brittle piece of sculpture that will snap at the slightest pull of the wind. You can care deeply about the people in your life without gripping their opinions so tightly that you fracture your own core. You can exist from a place of dense, self-contained mass, like an unworked spall resting securely in the grass, rather than as an overstrained monument waiting to be worn away by the rain. This also means that you are entirely permitted to drop into a deep, heavy rest tonight without needing to earn it through a day of flawless execution or social praise. Many of us carry a silent, agonizing guilt the moment our limbs try to soften, believing that if we are not actively adjusting our presentation or managing an outcome for our environment, we are failing. But your fundamental value as a living presence is not an ornate project that fluctuates based on how symmetrical you manage to appear before the sun went down. You do not have to resolve your whole life or perfect your form before you are allowed to close your eyes. Nor do you need to apologize for seeking a sanctuary from the critical glare of the village markets. Rest is not a luxury reserved for those who have achieved a perfect pattern. It is the natural, native right of a physical frame that belongs to the heavy, uncarved bedrock of the world. Let this unpolished clarity occupy your somatic awareness right now, as you lie beneath the heavy covers of your bed. When the memory of a social blunder or a painful comparison tries to pull your attention back up into the hot, friction-filled air of body anxiety, let the sheer weight of your bones serve as your anchor, pulling you straight down into the level floor. You can acknowledge that the vulnerability occurred without allowing it to dictate the shape of your current night. By choosing to let the perceived defect sit on your surface beneath a thick, cool layer of non-judgmental presence, you are gradually retraining your mind to understand that it is safe to drop the chisel. In a moment, the final echoes of these modern applications will begin to cool down entirely, letting the teaching pass from language into pure, inert sleep. The space surrounding your bed is growing increasingly heavy, the dark air absorbing your form without a single condition, measurement, or metric. You do not need to hold a rigid design for anyone tonight. You are simply a raw, unchipped fragment resting undisturbed in the tall grass of the night, completely hidden, completely unbothered, and absolutely secure within your own natural mass. The active, carving momentum of your thoughts is beginning to lose its edge now, cooling down into the quiet corners of the room, like a heavy layer of chalky dust settling over a deep, dark bedrock foundation. When the long day's work has spent its force, the absolute necessity to adjust your posture, the habit of tracking these comparisons, and the drive to sculpt your appearance can all be left behind in the tall grass tonight. Your physical frame is becoming intensely weighted, dropping into the level support of the bedding with an immense absolute gravity that cannot be countered by a restless memory or a midnight self-analysis. The wide muscles of your lower jaw are entirely relaxed. Your throat is cool and spacious, and your eyes are blanketed by a dense, unreacting shade that has no desire to scan the dark for a missing validation. Let the internal cadence of your pulse drop into a slow grounding movement, sinking into the deep, unchiseled chamber that holds your rest. There is not a single configuration left for you to correct tonight. The busy, visible galleries of the daytime have been locked up from the inside. The brittle cracking of the marble has stopped, and the voices that demanded you maintain a flawless symmetry have withdrawn into the shadows of the lower valley. You do not need to take your measurements, your social scores, or your masking habits under the covers with you. Let yourself slip entirely out of the heavy, rigid harness that you wore to navigate the critical gaze of a demanding world. You are entering a wide, quiet sanctuary where no features are pulled tight, no angles are being appraised, and no one is calculating your value based on your external presentation. The quiet atmosphere holds your skeleton with an absolute, unmoving security, treating your weariness as a natural, necessary return to the raw, uncarved baseline of the earth. Let your awareness sink all the way down into the heavy bones of your legs and spine, far beneath the high, vertical structures where self-conscious doubts are continually rehearsed. Imagine your entire presence as a vast, silent mountain root filled with dense, unpolished stone, sinking slowly into the cool, dark comfort of an uncelebrated night. The world may continue to move in its own volatile rhythm, and the unpredictable trends of beauty may continue to vibrate on the surface. But down here on the quarry floor, there is only a spacious, self-contained silence. You are resting on a foundation that is far too deep to be moved by the changing style of the town or the brittle cracks of a passing season. With each slow, unhurried exhalation, you are shedding the evolutionary urge to fix yourself through constant somatic worry. Let the heavy darkness of the night wrap around your shoulders like a protective, unadorned blanket of limestone dust, dampening every residual signal, cradling your tired chest in a permanent stillness. You have permission to abandon the gallery now. You have permission to let the coming years remain completely unworked, to drop the broad-faced iron pitching tool into the grass, and to simply allow your consciousness to unwind into the solid density of the unconditioned dark. You are returning home to the mineral quiet from which your form was first gathered, a place that requires absolutely no decoration to be completely whole. Gradually, the mind untethers itself from the necessity of public approval, sliding out into a deep, vast landscape of sleep where no features need to be manually held under comparison. The breathing has turned into a faint, automatic whisper, a slow and horizontal tide moving through an interior world that has entirely forgotten the rhythm of the mirror. You are safe here in the hidden yard, completely unreacting, completely unchipped, and profoundly complete within your own natural mass. When the hammer falls silent and the unworked stone finally drops into the deep grass, what if the raw shape you always hid was the only part of you that could never be broken? This raw, uncarved integrity requires no constant maintenance or adjustment, as it remains the permanent baseline of your awareness, resting silently beneath the shifting memories of the day like the deep, ancient mountain roots supporting the quiet valley floor. We spend our waking hours treating our self-worth like a delicate, brittle sculpture that will shatter if we do not constantly shield it from view, continuously striving to present an immaculate, symmetrical exterior for a world that loves to measure and critique. But the true, unyielding reality of your presence is that it cannot be permanently warped by an accidental awkwardness, an unreturned communication, or a sudden shift in another person's emotional perspective. Your core being is the very quarry in which all these passing judgments gather and dissolve a ground that remains absolutely dense, self-contained, and complete regardless of how many critical glances still echo through the village markets. Consider how the unworked block of black basalt behind the old limestone wall does not retain the frantic vibration of the hammers that echoed through the yard during the morning. It does not argue with the masonry layout. It does not hold a grudge against the hand that cast it aside into the weeds. And it does not worry whether its uneven texture will be celebrated by the temple priests tomorrow. It simply surrenders its physical mass to the absolute stillness of the ground, completely content to return to its native quiet state as a sovereign piece of mountain stone. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of non-resistance tonight, letting go of the exhausting nocturnal requirement to be an answer to every standard, an administrator of outcomes, or a perfect reflection of someone else's aesthetic timeline. You can allow the external world to move in its own volatile currents, knowing that your inner landscape is far too grounded to be consumed by an uncelebrated hour. Let this release travel deep into your somatic self, softening the final subconscious anchors of vigilance that still linger behind your ribs and around the base of your throat. For many seasons, Your body has been conditioned to treat a perceived physical defect or a moment of social isolation as an immediate emergency that must be instantly settled through a mental review before you are permitted to rest. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this constant internal labor is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the night. You do not have to fight the self-conscious thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into a state of artificial silence. You can simply allow the vulnerability to sit on your surface beneath a thick, cooling blanket of non-judgmental presence, trusting that its erratic cracking will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a day of flawless execution or social validation. The old habit of checking your device for reassurance, of comparing your private, unpolished timeline to the bright, edited milestones of those around you, has absolutely no function in this midnight sanctuary. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your emotional output, and no metric you must achieve to be worthy of this profound dark. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine stone dust, drifting down into a quiet mountain stream. The structural understanding has moved past the level of language now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the mattress. The events of the day, the messages left waiting, the minor frustrations, the persistent whisper that your natural form is not doing enough to stay accepted by the crowd, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the masonry yard. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide, horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward to a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This timeless, unchipped baseline of your existence requires no further modification or carving, as it remains the permanent, unbending anchor of your awareness, resting silently beneath the shifting memories of the day, like the deep, ancient limestone bedrock supporting the entire mountain ridge. We spend our waking hours treating our peace of mind like an intricate, brittle piece of sculpture that will completely shatter if we do not constantly shield it from view, continuously striving to present an immaculate, symmetrical exterior for a world that loves to evaluate and critique. But the true, unyielding reality of your presence is that it cannot be permanently warped by a casual snub, a bad camera angle, or a sudden change in another person's emotional weather. Your core being is the very quarry in which all these passing judgments gather and dissolve a ground that remains absolutely dense, self-contained, and complete regardless of how many critical glances still echo through the village markets. Consider how the unworked block of black basalt behind the old limestone wall does not retain the frantic vibration of the hammers that echoed through the yard during the morning. It does not argue with the masonry layout. It does not hold a grudge against the hand that cast it aside into the weeds, and it does not worry whether its uneven texture will be celebrated by the temple priests tomorrow. It simply surrenders its physical mass to the absolute stillness of the ground, completely content to return to its native, quiet state as a sovereign piece of mountain stone. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of non-resistance tonight, letting go of the exhausting, nocturnal requirement to be an answer to every standard, an administrator of outcomes, or a perfect reflection of someone else's aesthetic timeline. You can allow the external world to move in its own volatile currents, knowing that your inner landscape is far too grounded to be consumed by an uncelebrated hour. Let this release travel deep into your somatic self, softening the final, subconscious anchors of vigilance that still linger behind your ribs and around the base of your throat. For many seasons, your body has been conditioned to treat a perceived physical defect or a moment of social isolation as an immediate emergency that must be instantly settled through a mental review before you are permitted to rest. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this constant internal labor is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the night. You do not have to fight the self-conscious thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into a state of artificial silence. You can simply allow the vulnerability to sit on your surface beneath a thick, cooling blanket of non-judgmental presence, trusting that its erratic cracking will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a day of flawless execution or social validation. The old habit of checking your device for reassurance, of comparing your private, unpolished timeline to the bright, edited milestones of those around you, has absolutely no function in this midnight sanctuary. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your emotional output, and no metric you must achieve to be worthy of this profound dark. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine stone dust drifting down into a quiet mountain stream. The structural understanding has moved past the level of language now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the mattress. The events of the day, the messages left waiting, the minor frustrations, the persistent whisper that your natural form is not doing enough to stay accepted by the crowd, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the masonry yard. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival, or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This deep alignment with your uncarved nature acts as a solid, permanent counterweight to the frantic pacing of the modern world, grounding your somatic self far below the superficial currents of comparison. Like a massive foundation block buried beneath the shifting sands of a riverbank, we pass our waking hours holding our breath in the presence of others, desperately maintaining a rigid, immaculate scaffolding behind our expressions out of a persistent fear that our true, unpolished self will be judged as insufficient. But the profound reality of your presence tonight is that it cannot be diminished by an unreturned look, an uncelebrated day, or the casual exclusion of a crowd. Your core being is the vast, quiet expanse in which all these passing social shadows arise and dissolve, a baseline of pure, unbothered awareness that remains entirely whole and unyielding regardless of how much or how little you have achieved in the village below. Consider how an ancient, moss-covered stone wall at the edge of the mountain forest does not grieve when the path beside it falls silent, and the travelers have all departed for the night. It does not look back at the midday hours with a sense of regret, nor does it tense its mineral grain in anticipation of the steps that will pass by its perimeter tomorrow. It simply surrenders its immense mass to the dark, completely content to be exactly what it is, a quiet, unpatterned boundary that asks for nothing but the freedom to rest flat against the earth. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of total non-resistance tonight, dropping the exhausting psychological requirement to be an answer to every standard, a perfect reflection of a modern trend, or a tireless architect of an unpredictable future. You can let the external world move in its own volatile loops, knowing that your inner landscape is far too dense to be fractured by an unrecorded hour. Let this structural release travel deep into your physical frame, softening the small, subconscious pockets of vigilance that still linger behind your collarbones and beneath your eyelids. For so long, your body has been trained to treat a quiet, unadorned margin as a dangerous vacuum that must be immediately filled with self-criticism or complex planning to justify your space in the world. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this continuous internal labor is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the evening. You do not have to fight the anxious thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into an artificial numbness. You can simply allow the self-consciousness to exist as a faint, harmless echo on your surface, trusting that it will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a day of flawless execution or public approval. The old habit of checking your device for reassurance, of comparing your private, unpolished timeline to the bright, edited milestones of those around you, has absolutely no function in this midnight environment. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your emotional output, and no standard you must achieve to be worthy of this profound rest. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like a grain of sand melting back into a quiet mountain stream. The structural understanding has moved past the level of words now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the earth. The events of the day, the messages left waiting, the minor anxieties, the persistent whisper that you are falling behind the conventional design of a successful life, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the coastline. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide, horizontal presence, resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide, carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is.